This is our, thank you. This is our last happy hour of the year, and we are very excited to close it out with our awesome team from the government relations arm of NCBA Cruise's work to speak to the 2024 presidential and overall election, excuse me.
Membership team for facilitating this very timely discussion here. We can go to the next slide. Today's topic, we'll be talking about that election that happened a few weeks ago, both for members of Congress and the president, and what the outcomes are, how we are shaping our advocacy strategy, how you all can get plugged in, and where we really see things moving forward in the next few weeks, months, and years here. And the good news, going to the next slide, despite all of the dynamics that we'll jump into, is that cooperatives at its core are nonpartisan. Cooperatives have stakeholders across every sector, and that's reflected in the policymakers who support cooperatives, who come from all walks of the political spectrum. And with that in mind, we have a new administration. The key is education. I think a lot of you folks know on this call much better than we do how many folks just aren't aware that co-ops are out here as a business model, as a way to meet the needs of our time. And so education will be key with this new administration, who is not so new as it's a second term, but it will look a little bit different. We know that a number of cabinet picks are coming out every day, and we're getting this influx of news and shifts in federal agencies potentially. And leadership will look different. So that means we'll need to reach out and continue to beat the drum and tell folks the great story that cooperatives have, how they can serve communities across the country, all communities, and how we can use them as a tool, and how policymakers can support cooperative development through their policies. Going to the next slide here. So this is just a visual, and for folks who are looking at all of this information, we will share it with you because it's a lot being thrown at you at once, and I'll be moving pretty quickly here as we want to have a robust discussion. But just highlighting here what the makeup of Congress looks like. Congress meets for 2 years at a time at the federal level to fund the government, to create programs, to support new initiatives. And next year, we expect to see Republican control of both the legislative and executive branch. So from the presidency to the Senate to the House. But again, in Congress, there's also new leadership who have committed to doing things differently, to moving quickly, to staying in DC for long swaths of time. And so this is just a little bit more information on those dynamics. It will be challenging to move some pieces of legislation. As the bottom bullet you can see, it's 215 to 220 of a majority, but a few members are moving to the cabinet, which means there will need to be consensus and agreements and negotiations from Democrats and Republicans to get things done. Go to the next slide. So I won't belabor this point here, but we do have key allies who are well aware of co-ops, folks who could use more education. Going to the next slide. And on that front, just wanted to highlight some changes that are coming. For NCBA CLUSA, the Farm Bill is a big priority. And so the Agriculture Committee will now have a new ranking member, the top Democrat, leading those negotiations. And with Minnesotans who are in the House today, we know that Senator Klobuchar is a good friend of cooperatives, as is Senator Bozeman, who was NCBA CLUSA's co-op champion. Appropriations is the committee that funds a lot of our new priorities, such as the Rural Cooperative Development Grant, the Cooperative Development Program, as well as the Employee Ownership Initiative, which is a new program at the Department of Labor to support worker co-op development. On the finance committee, they'll be working on taxes, another longstanding priority that Joe will touch on later, and a huge tax package that we expect to see early next year. And then on the banking and housing side of things, we also have a new top Democrat in Elizabeth Warren, a new chair with Senator Tim Scott, and a new top Democrat for the Small Business Committee who informs our issues with the SBA and Senator Markey. Next slide here. In the House, things will look relatively the same, but I did want to point out a few changes in those similar committees that you can take a look at a little bit closer. And going to the next slide. Despite all of these dynamics, these thin majorities, these changes in leadership, we do have a bipartisan cooperative congressional business caucus for folks who are located in the United States here, which many folks on the call are. I would encourage you to invite your representative in Congress to join this caucus. It's shrunk a little bit as some longtime supporters, think about almost 10 folks have either retired or lost their reelection. So recruitment will be a huge effort. And we do need your help in this. And you all are the best advocates. Cooperators are modest folks, but we need folks to brag about yourselves and the work you're doing in your community to bring that story to policymakers at the federal level. Next slide. So I've touched on this a little bit, but I do just want to highlight it is encouraging in respects to have a party control all three chambers or the executive branch and the two chambers in Congress, because that means they can move things through fairly quickly, including our priorities, which again, as cooperatives are nonpartisan, there is an encouraging future. And in the first quarter of 2025, we expect to see a push to move through some big pieces of legislation, particularly on tax policy, which directly impacts us, and other items that allows them to pass it with a simple majority. And going to the next slide here. These are the big ticket items ahead. Again, with these dynamics coming up starting on January 3rd, when the new Congress begins, we still have some things to take care of in the next 2 weeks here. Number one is funding the federal government. There's an extension in place that ends on December 20th, and we expect to see another year extension, or excuse me, a few months extension of the federal budget negotiations to give folks a little bit of room to get familiar with how federal legislating works and to decide on who will serve on these key committees. There's also the Farm Bill, which is expected to be extended for another year and giving us another window of opportunity to support key programs through the Farm Bill pertaining to agriculture cooperatives, rural electric cooperatives, and cooperative development internationally and domestic. But again, I can't illustrate this point enough. The first quarter of 2025 will be crucial in terms of inviting your members of Congress to your co-op, reaching out to them to let them know this huge community that we all work to cultivate is here, and how it can be helpful since we have 70 new members coming into Congress in January and more than 200 new members since the last tax package or Farm Bill. Next slide. This is the first 100 days. I don't want to dive too deep here to leave room for our conversation. But again, the budget conversation will be front and center. And next slide here. What we do know right now, because things are changing every day, is that there will be a focus on the budget. Our work at NCBA CLUSA will continue, and we know that co-ops make the case regardless of party or affiliation. And again, that telling the co-op story through our advocacy by, boasting about the great work that cooperatives and cooperators like yourselves are doing in your community is more important now than ever, and you are the best advocates to push the policies forward. And so to get into those priorities, I'll kick it over to Joe here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And we can go ahead and head to the next slide, please. So I'm going to be going over our cooperative policy priorities that we're going to be focused on in 2025. Olivia and myself will be advocating on behalf of cooperatives across all sectors, but we also, as she said, need the help of the cooperative community to be effective advocates. And so you'll hear from me about some of the main priorities that we'll be targeting in 2025. The first of which being preserving cooperative tax treatment. Aaliyah mentioned the expiration of TCJA. I'll get into the details of cooperative of what we'll be advocating for in a little bit, but that is a longstanding priority that we'll be working heavily on in the first quarter. Additionally, we've mentioned the Farm Bill. We're expecting to see an extension, and throughout 2025, we'll work to continue to ensure that cooperative priorities are included in a final version of a new Farm Bill. Additionally, NCBA-CLUSA does international cooperative development work. So we'll be advocating for programs that NCBA-CLUSA utilizes through the U.S. Agency for International Development, such as the Cooperative Development Program, and additionally, international food assistance programs through USDA, such as McGovern-Dole and the Food for Progress Act. Access to capital for small businesses with a particular focus on worker-owned cooperatives is something that we are in the thick of, as Aaliyah mentioned, with the introduction of 2 new bills by Ranking Member Nadia Velasquez to address issues with the Small Business Administration. Housing co-ops are also at the forefront of our advocacy priorities, ensuring that they're included in affordable housing programs and some of the programs that support cooperatives, streamlining them to support a wider range and more housing cooperatives. And then as we go into 2025, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has made it clear that they are looking to cut funding where it can be cut. And we expect funding levels to be lower than we've seen over the past 4 years. So preserving some of the existing funding that has been established over the past 4 years is extremely important, including funds through the Inflation Reduction Act, programs like the Recompete Pilot Program, which invests in economically distressed communities to create stable jobs, as well as the Work Act, Worker Ownership, Readiness and Knowledge Act, which helps provide grants to state employee ownership programs. And we can go to the next slide, please, Manisha. So we'll start with the Farm Bill. These are all the priorities that we will be working on in 2025. There's too many here to go into all of them, but I'll call out the Rural Cooperative Development Grant Program, RCDG. This is through USDA. We have been working on improving this program for our cooperative development centers that help develop cooperatives of all kinds throughout rural communities. And these are either located at universities or through nonprofit organizations. And we were successful in the past year in introducing the Strengthening Rural Cooperatives and Communities Act, which would allow these cooperative development centers to get multi-year grants to not have to apply for funding year in and year out. It also streamlines some of the application process and make the matching requirement uniform for across the board for cooperatives. Some additional topics I'll call out includes the Rural Partnership and Prosperity Act. This would provide multi-year awards to rural communities to address urgent needs such as childcare. And we've seen an expansion of childcare co-ops, and so support there, as well as support for housing and job training in rural communities. And lastly, I'll call it the Rural Energy Savings Program. Is a program that allows cooperatives to support members of their community by financing energy efficiency upgrades. So these are bills that we'll be working on in 2025 to hopefully have included in the final version of a Farm Bill once we see that. And as Aaliyah mentioned, we'll be sharing these slides, so you'll be able to access all this information, and we can head to the next one, please. So one of our main priorities is promoting and facilitating employee ownership. There's been a rising tide of retiring business owners. This has been dubbed the silver tsunami of folks in communities across the country who are reaching retirement age and either selling their business off or closing it completely. So one thing that NCBA CLUSA has been focused on is the conversion of those businesses to worker-owned businesses. And one of the programs that is going to be key in supporting this is the Employee Ownership Initiative, authorized through the Work Act, that we've mentioned a couple times here, through the Department of Labor. And another topic is, again, the access to capital for co-ops, and we'll have a little more detail on the next slide. So in terms of access to SBA financing for cooperatives, in the current state of play, SBA 7A is the main lending program for small businesses through the Small Business Administration. Co-ops are effectively barred from this program due to a personal guarantee requirement, which essentially somebody from the business who owns 20% or more of it needs to sign a personal guarantee if that business were to default on their loan. When you think about the cooperative model, nobody's going to own 20% of the business just due to the model, and everybody owning an equal share in it. In 2018, the ranking member of, or the chair at the time of the Small Business Committee, Nadia Velasquez, was able to pass, with support of NCBA CLUSA, was able to pass the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, which had the Small Business Administration look into alternatives for cooperatives to access the 7A lending program. SBA has made it clear that they will not offer an alternative to the personal guarantee unless mandated by law. It would take an act of Congress for them to offer an alternative. So working with Representative Nadia Velasquez, we're able to assist in the introduction of Main Street 2.0 Employee Ownership Act, as well as the SBA Improving SBA Engagement Act. This would mandate them, SBA, to get rid of, or not get rid of completely, but offer an alternative for cooperative businesses to access 7A loan program, as well as have the SBA engage more directly with worker ownership through meetings such as the Interagency Working Group on Cooperative Development. And on the Work Act, this was passed in 2023 as part of the Appropriations Omnibus. It is $50 million over 5 years, authorized within the Department of Labor to support existing state employee ownership programs. So states can apply for grants to then support the conversion of businesses to employee ownership. And what we're looking to do with this program is ensure that it is funded. It's authorized at $5 million, but it needs to be appropriated year in and year out. And in 2025, that amount is $4 million. And so NCBA will be working with the employee-owned, with worker owners and the cooperative community to ensure that that funding is there to continue this work. And another result of this would be the Department of Labor creating a clearinghouse of resource for cooperatives or people looking to convert to a cooperative to use as a guideline. And then we can head to the next slide, please. So the next slide is on tax treatment. Since the inception of NCBA CLUSA, one of our main charges has been to defend cooperative tax status and ensure that tax policy acknowledges the benefits that cooperatives bring to their member owners. Currently, tax policy does acknowledge this, and in 2025, we will be working to ensure that that remains true, and that none of the programs that benefit cooperatives sunset, such as the 199A tax exemption, which I'll get into on the next slide. So as we all know, cooperatives provide their member owners with dividends, giving them the economic benefits of owning that business as a member owner. Cooperatives currently are taxed either at the individual or the entity level, but not both. Subchapter T is a regulation that governs cooperative businesses, including ag co-ops and worker co-ops, which allows them to deduct dividends given to their members from their taxable income, their gross income. And on the 199A tax exemption, a little bit about why it's a big priority for NCBA CLUSA to defend with the 2017 tax package expiring. 199A allows pass-through entities. Pass-through entities are any business where the income generated by that business is passed directly to the owner of that business. So when we think about that in a cooperative lens, that would include agriculture co-ops and worker co-ops where the member owners are the direct recipients of the income of that business. And what it allows them to do is to deduct 20% of the money that they earn from that business from their taxable income. And so it's a benefit for worker owners as well as ag cooperative members. And so the cooperative community is working, we are working to have a coalition between worker co-ops, ag co-ops to defend this tax exemption for cooperatives and ensure that it's not sunset in 2025. And we can head to the next slide, please. Just a couple more here before we get to our discussion, but increasing affordable housing through cooperatives is something that I mentioned earlier and also is a project that we've been working on over the past year. So some of the main priorities that we'll be advocating for in 2025 include ensuring that co-ops are included in affordable housing programs. So when you have an affordable housing program and it mentions multifamily housing or things of that nature, that co-ops are included in that definition, so that they're able to access funding that other models of housing, affordable housing, are also able to access. And I mentioned some specific programs where that support cooperative housing. One of those is the HUD Section 213. This is funding directly for the development of housing cooperatives. In practice, HUD has used it for the development of senior housing cooperatives. While this is important work and we support the use of the funding for senior housing cooperatives, there's the ability baked in there for Section 213 to support cooperatives of all kinds, including limited equity cooperatives. So we're aiming to work with HUD to expand the use of this program. Additionally, there is a longstanding line in the National Housing Act of 1955, which requires HUD to appoint a special assistant for cooperative housing. Now, this position hasn't been filled in the past decades. So we're additionally advocating for the assignment of a special assistant for cooperative housing to be an internal advocate for cooperatives within HUD to, one, increase education of housing cooperatives, the fact that they exist and should be included in definitions of affordable housing programs, and two, to expand existing use of programs like Section 213. And then we got one more slide that we'll head to next. Thank you, Maisha. And this is just a little bit about a little taste about cooperatives in the housing sector. So limited equity cooperatives are an affordable option and can help people as a pathway to home ownership, in the sense that while living in a cooperative, you own a share in the cooperative, and it is permanently affordable housing. So we see a lot of limited equity co-ops that are still in communities that have either been rapidly gentrified, but they've been able to remain permanently affordable through the model of being a cooperative. And then resident-owned communities are manufactured housing, where the residents of that community own the land below them and are able to govern how the community is run, rent charges for lots, etc. And two programs that, or two areas that we're going to advocate for in 2025 is the inclusion of co-ops and resident-owned communities in VA home loans, as well as the ability for cooperatives to access FEMA disaster resistance. As currently, co-ops can't access FEMA disaster resistance for their shared spaces. So, any residential like shared space, lobbies, meeting rooms, etc., they can't access funding for FEMA disaster assistance, which, as we've seen over the past month, is important to say the very, very least. And we'll be advocating for the passage of bills such as HR 3777, which is the Disaster Assistance Fairness Act, which would include cooperatives under the FEMA disaster assistance. So that's all what we'll be working on in 2025. Really looking forward to working with you all and other members of the cooperative community as we go out throughout this new Congress. And I'll pass it back over to Aaliyah or Maisha for questions and to have a bit of discussion.
And thank you, Joe, for going through our priorities. Thank you, everyone who I see is engaging in the chat here. Just want to hone in on some points that Joe made here and throughout the presentation, and to open up our discussion here. But through our policy priorities, they are consistent and very timely as they are presenting how cooperatives are a solution to the crises of our time for housing when it comes to access to capital, to supporting small businesses and preserving community institutions that are small businesses, to making sure that the direct benefit that cooperatives provide to member owners through patronage and distributing the economic benefits of the business is recognized in our tax policy and preserved as a longstanding priority, and supporting the broader international community to build a better world in line with NCBA-CLUSA's mission, vision, and the ethos of co-ops across all sectors. So with that, I know we've talked a lot, thrown a lot at you. Ways that you can get involved. I dropped a link in the chat for folks who want to endorse the SBA access to capital bills for co-ops across sectors: consumer, worker, multi-stakeholder, purchasing. You can click on that link to learn more about the bills. We also have a virtual Hike the Hill that we started last year. We'll do again this year. And our in-person Hike the Hill, where folks can go up, meet with their members of Congress, meet with these leaders who are coming in, and speak to them directly about your experience with cooperatives and how we can move the needle forward. So with that, as folks are thinking of questions, or if you have them, feel free to come off mute, throw them in the chat, and I will, we'd be happy to open up a discussion, but please.
Just maybe give folks another second. And again, feel free to come off mute if you'd like. You do not have to turn your camera to do that. Okay. Well, if you do decide that you have some questions that pop up after today's conversation, you are more than welcome to contact our team directly. I have dropped in our chat the email address to contact Aaliyah and Joe if you have specific questions that you might not feel is best for the group. And as the team has already shared, we are happy to share some of the snippets from today's conversation. We will be following up with you all with some post-event communications as well. So you'll be able to have the slide deck here today, along with the recording to be able to reference back to. And so if you're ready to reach out to the team, you have that package of information to be able to do that. Okay, so last call for questions, if anybody has anything.
I actually came up with a question.
Perfect.
I think Aaliyah mentioned the virtual Hike the Hill. Will you be notifying us when that's going to be happening?
Yes, absolutely. And our
Excellent.
fantastic membership team facilitates, and we work closely to get that word out and to facilitate the 3 days of meetings that we did. We'll have them going on simultaneously, where you can talk about issues specific to your co-ops, the co-op community at large, and really let folks here in DC who can be far removed from their constituencies at times know how they can help. But yes, absolutely, we'll let you know. And for folks who are on the call, has anyone met with policymakers? Have you had experience? Would love to hear about your experience talking to either your local government, economic development, city council member, if you have or are interested in doing so.
I was actually just looking at your list of the Bipartisan Congressional Cooperative Business Caucus. It's a very small list. And And I'm surprised that there's nobody from Oklahoma on there, because we do have, historically, at least the electric cooperatives have a really good relationship with our not just our local, but our Washington DC senators and representatives. So what could be holding them back from joining this? Is it just a matter of adding one more thing to their calendar that they need to know that we care about, or?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, Tori. And it's a list that has shrunk quite a bit with this last election, and some folks moving out. And I think it's folks either don't know about the caucus or need to hear directly from people within their districts and their states, because they hear about co-ops when we meet with them and they're like, oh yeah, we love co-ops. But being aware of the caucus itself and having folks like yourself say, hey, did you know there's this group where you can indicate your support across sectors and connect with other folks to learn, maybe if you know about rural electrics, but not necessarily housing co-ops, that there's this broader world out there. So we do really encourage and rely on our members of getting the word out in terms of the caucus.
Okay.
Great question. Anyone else have another question?
I might just add that it's an interesting, one might say a cluster something or a blender, or it's a ripe opportunity to really listen and learn, to try to do exactly as you're asking. And so in Alaska, with our state delegation and the differences in the national political realities, and then collapsing on the reality for communities, whether it's more rural or the more urban, such as it is here, um, it's really about the time and the listening, because people are aunties and uncles and their parents and grandparents, and they're that structure and the confidence that they're going to be heard. And if it's a business, if it's a nonprofit organization, if it's whatever it is, that structure is of less importance. They just want to know that whatever the structure is, it's going to support the relationships so that they can continue to show up and to not be a burden, but to actually contribute to earn their way to return. So it's this, we have a second class borough, which with this Alaska state law puts our local assembly and local mayors in a really weird situation that they have no health and human services powers. And like, it's this really interesting mix of nobody really has regulatory authority to really do much. And so we're really dependent completely on the cooperative model, whether it's an LLC or if it's a nonprofit. But the practice of how those can be supported to move forward, because at scale, we're gonna have to figure something else out, because there isn't another response after a couple more years. I mean, our grid, the demands, everything. It's really, really kind of plump, that kind of cluster. Instead of it being a mess, it's more of, kind of a lot of fertilization, that there's a lot of possibility. And so that listening, that really kind of taking the time, that the structures that we deliver from this time moving forward, that we're building in the time for our authority and our leaders to listen now, so that our young leaders witness how we can get more done in that practice. That's one thing that I would pass on from what Alaska as a state, and we can look at what our national representation has done, but then down to the local and then very micro level on how we're dealing with AI and neighbors reporting on what's going on with the roads or any of that stuff. We're aunties and uncles, we're grandparents, so we're all on the right track. A long-winded way to say that.
That was an excellent comment and point of feedback, Ramey. And, I say that all politics are local politics. So even these priorities, while we at NCBA CLUSA talk about them at a national level, it all comes down to the local level and the folks who are doing the work day to day in the communities, and demystifying the elected officials, and being able to tell your story and connect with those folks who are also coming to Washington, D.C. And so if you're meeting with them directly in your communities, your city council members, even down to the neighborhood commissions, as we have in DC, they can also be messengers for the cooperative model and the change you need to see in your community, and how the federal government can support that. And if folks are interested in learning more, even about how to request a meeting with folks, we're always happy as a team to provide that feedback and those resources as well.
Perfect.
Other folks' thoughts, questions?
And with that, again, we thank you all for your time today. We hope to see you at our next Co-op Circle Happy Hour, which will take place in January of 2025.